I'm Emily Martinez, and I'm standing in the marble lobby of Pinnacle Wealth Management in downtown Phoenix, holding a set of keys that supposedly unlock a life I never knew existed. 6 months ago, my husband Brad walked out on me, leaving me with nothing but a pile of bills and a broken heart. He called me a financial burden, said I'd never amount to anything more than a school teacher, living paycheck to paycheck. What he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that my eccentric great-aunt Isabelle had left me something that would change everything. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in a modest duplex in central Phoenix, I learned early that money didn't grow on trees. My mother Carmen worked double shifts at the garment factory, her fingers constantly moving over fabric, stitching together other people's dreams, while barely holding on to our own. The house smelled like the jasmine she'd planted by the front door, and the beans she'd simmer for hours to make them stretch through the week. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich either. We were somewhere in that invisible middle, where you count every dollar but still manage to find joy in small things. My great-aunt Isabelle was the family enigma, the one relative who seemed to exist in her own colorful world. She'd show up to family gatherings in flowing scarves and chunky jewelry, telling stories about her restaurant business that sounded too wild to be true. She claimed to own properties across the Southwest, spoke of investment meetings and business deals, but we'd just smile and nod. To us, she was the eccentric aunt who never married, lived alone in a small apartment, and had more stories than sense. When I was 15, Aunt Isabelle pulled me aside at a family barbecue. Her weathered hands adorned with rings that caught the desert sun, held mine tightly. "Mija," she said, her voice carrying the weight of secrets. "Someday you'll understand that the most valuable things in life are often hidden in plain sight. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you feel small because of where you come from." I promised, though I didn't understand why her eyes held such intensity, why she seemed to be telling me something far more important than her words revealed. 2 months later, Aunt Isabelle died peacefully in her sleep. The family gathered for the funeral, and afterward, a lawyer in a crisp suit handed me an envelope. "She left you a small inheritance," he said with a kind smile. "Your mother has the detail." When I opened it later, I found a savings account with $5,000 and a note that simply said, "For your education, Mija, make me proud." It was more money than I'd ever seen, and it felt like a fortune. Mom deposited it in a college fund and we never spoke of it again. The lawyer mentioned something about other arrangements, but in our grief, the details got lost. That money helped me through Arizona State University, where I studied elementary education. While other students partied or stressed about their futures, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach, to make a difference in young lives, to be the kind of teacher who saw potential in every student. It wasn't glamorous and it certainly wasn't lucrative, but it filled my heart in ways that money never could. It was during my student teaching semester that I met Brad Thompson. He was 25, confident, and everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He worked at a marketing firm, drove a nice car, and had an easy smile that made me feel special. He'd pick me up from the elementary school where I was doing my practicum, and I'd climb into his sedan, feeling like I was stepping into a different world. "You're too good for this," he'd say, watching me organize construction paper and crayons for the next day's lesson. "Teaching is noble, but you could do so much more with your life." I'd laugh it off, thinking he was just being supportive, encouraging me to dream bigger. I didn't realize then that he was already categorizing me, placing me into the box labeled needs improvement. Our courtship was everything I'd imagined romance should be. He took me to restaurants I'd never been able to afford, bought me clothes that made me feel sophisticated, and introduced me to his friends as his beautiful teacher girlfriend. I felt like I was being elevated, brought into a world of professional success and social status that had always seemed out of reach. When Brad proposed after 2 years of dating, he did it at the top of South Mountain, overlooking the sprawling lights of Phoenix. The ring was modest by today's standards, but to me it represented everything I'd ever wanted: love, commitment, and the promise of building something beautiful together. I said yes with tears in my eyes, genuinely believing I was the luckiest woman in the world. The early years of our marriage were blissful, or at least, that's how I remember them now. We bought a house in Scottsdale, a 3-bedroom ranch style with a small pool and a yard where I could plant the same jasmine my mother had loved. Brad was building his career, eventually becoming partner in his marketing firm, while I found my rhythm as a third-grade teacher at Desert View Elementary. Our lives had a comfortable predictability that I mistook for happiness, but somewhere along the way, Brad began to change. The man who had once admired my dedication to teaching began to see it as a limitation. "Don't you want more?" became his constant refrain. "Don't you want to make real money, have real impact?" He'd compare me to his colleagues' wives, women who worked in finance or real estate, who brought home substantial paychecks, and could discuss market trends over dinner. I tried to explain that teaching was my calling, that seeing a struggling student finally understand a concept, watching shy children find their confidence, helping families navigate their children's educational journey, these things had value beyond a paycheck. But Brad had already decided that my job was a hobby, something I did to feel useful while he handled the real responsibility of supporting us. The criticism became more frequent and more cutting. When we'd attend his company events, he'd introduce me as just a teacher, the word just carrying all the weight of his disappointment. When I'd share stories about my students, he'd change the subject to his latest business deal. When I'd suggest we couldn't afford certain luxuries on our combined income, he'd remind me that if I had a real career, money wouldn't be such a concern. I began to shrink, to make myself smaller to fit into the space he'd carved out for me. I stopped talking about my students, stopped sharing my excitement about new teaching methods or classroom innovations. I started looking at job postings for administrative positions that paid more but would take me away from the classroom. I thought if I could just earn more, contribute more financially, maybe Brad would see me as a partner again instead of a burden. The shift became most apparent during our social interaction. At neighborhood barbecues, while other couples shared stories about their weekend adventures or home improvement projects, Brad would find ways to highlight our financial limitations. "We'd love to remodel the kitchen like you did," he'd say with a meaningful look in my direction. "But teacher salaries, you know." The shame would burn in my chest as I watched other wives, the real estate agent, the bank manager, the consultant, exchange glances of sympathy mixed with superiority. I started picking up tutoring jobs on weekends, telling myself it was to help students who needed extra support, but really it was to bring in additional income that might ease the tension at home. The extra money helped, but it also meant longer days and less time for the relationship that was already straining under the weight of unspoken resentments. Brad's business was doing well, very well actually. The marketing firm he'd joined as a junior associate had grown into a successful agency, and his partnership stake was generating substantial income. But instead of our improved financial situation bringing us closer together, it seemed to highlight what he saw as the growing gap between his professional success and my chosen limitations. "I'm thinking about buying a new car," he announced one evening over dinner. "The BMW dealership has a lease program that would work perfectly." I nodded, accustomed to his unilateral financial decisions. But then he continued, "Of course, we'd need to be careful about other expenses. Maybe you could pack lunch more often instead of buying it at school." Little things add up. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was planning to spend more on a car payment than I made in 3 months, while asking me to save money on a $5 sandwich. But I'd learned that questioning his financial priorities only led to lectures about business image and professional requirements that I apparently couldn't understand. Friends began to notice the dynamic. Rachel Kim, my best friend since college, would watch Brad dismiss my contributions to conversations, or redirect attention to his own achievements. She'd say carefully during our coffee dates, "You seem different lately. Smaller, somehow. Is everything okay at home?" I'd assure her that everything was fine, that Brad was just focused on his career, that all couples went through phases of adjustment. But privately, I was beginning to feel like a guest in my own life, like I was apologizing for existing, for not being the high-earning, ambitious woman he'd apparently expected me to become. The beginning of the end came during a dinner party at our house. Brad had invited his business partner Mike Johnson and his wife, along with another couple from their professional circle. I'd spent the day preparing, making sure the house was perfect, cooking his favorite appetizers, setting the table with our wedding china. I wanted to be the kind of wife who made him proud, who fit seamlessly into his professional world. As the evening progressed, conversation naturally flowed to work, investments, and financial plan. Mike's wife Sarah was discussing her job as a financial advisor, sharing insights about market trends and investment strategies. The other wife, Jennifer, was a pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled frequently and earned a six-figure income. I listened, contributing where I could, but mostly feeling like an observer in a world where I didn't quite belong. "What about you, Emily?" Jennifer asked kindly. "Brad mentioned you're in education. Are you working on any interesting projects?" I brightened, grateful for the inclusion. "Actually, I'm really excited about a new literacy program we're implementing. We're seeing incredible results with students who were previously struggling with reading comprehension. The methodology combines—" "That's great, honey," Brad interrupted, his tone suggesting anything but enthusiasm. But Jennifer was asking about work projects. Professional development, career advancement, that sort of thing. The table fell silent for a moment, the awkwardness palpable. Sarah tried to recover by asking about the literacy program, but the damage was done. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the sense that my passion and expertise were being reduced to something quaint and insignificant. Later, as we cleaned up after the guest had left, Brad was unusually quiet. I thought perhaps he was tired, or maybe he'd recognized how dismissive he'd been, and was feeling regretful. I was wrong. He said, loading dishes into the dishwasher with unnecessary force. "It's embarrassing when you go on and on about your little teaching projects in front of my colleagues. These are serious professionals, Emily. They're talking about real business, real money, real impact." I stood holding a wine glass, my reflection distorted in its surface. "Real impact? I'm helping children learn to read, Brad. I'm shaping the next generation. How is that not real?" He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of frustration and something that looked almost like pity. "Because it doesn't matter in the real world, Em. Your students will forget you in 6 months, but the deals Mike and I are working on, the businesses we're building, the money we're generating, that has lasting impact. That changes things." The words hit me like a physical blow. For 8 years I'd been slowly accepting his version of my worth, allowing him to diminish my sense of purpose and value. But hearing him say that my students would forget me, that the love and care I poured into my classroom every day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meant nothing. That broke something inside me that I didn't know how to fix. I went to bed that night, feeling more alone than I had since my mother died 3 years earlier. Brad fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady and unburdened, while I stared at the ceiling wondering how I'd become so small, so invisible, so apologetic for existing. I thought about Aunt Isabel's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small because of where you come from." I realized I'd been letting Brad make me feel small, not because of where I came from, but because of who I was choosing to be. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I deserved better than a marriage where I was constantly made to feel inadequate. I deserved a partner who saw my work as valuable, who celebrated my successes instead of minimizing them, who loved me for who I was instead of resenting me for who I wasn't. But knowing you deserve better and having the courage to demand it are two different things. I spent the next few weeks oscillating between determination and doubt, between anger and sadness, between hope for change and acceptance of reality. I started seeing a counselor, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who helped me understand that healthy relationships build people up rather than tear them down. "You've been accepting crumbs," she said during one of our sessions, "and calling it a feast, but you deserve a full meal, Emily. You deserve to be seen, valued, and celebrated for exactly who you are." I began to document the patterns in our relationship, not to build a case against Brad, but to understand how I'd lost myself so completely. I wrote about the comments, the dismissals, the way he'd trained me to anticipate his disappointment and adjust my behavior accordingly. I wrote about the woman I'd been when we met, passionate and confident, and the woman I'd become, apologetic and diminished. The documentation process was painful but necessary. It helped me see that this wasn't about one bad evening or a temporary rough patch. This was about fundamental incompatibility, about values that couldn't be reconciled, about a dynamic that had become toxic for both of us. I began to imagine a different life, one where I could come home excited to share stories about my students, where I could pursue professional development without being made to feel like I was wasting time on unimportant things, where I could be proud of my work and my contributions to the world. It seemed almost impossible to imagine, but the seed of possibility had been planted. The conversation I'd been dreading finally happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Brad came home from work with an energy I hadn't seen in months, excited about a new client acquisition that would significantly boost the firm's revenue. He was animated, confident, successful, everything he wanted to be, and everything he'd convinced me I was. "This changes everything, Emmy," he said, pacing around our kitchen with barely contained excitement. "This client alone will bring in more revenue than most people make in 5 years. Mike and I are talking about expanding, maybe opening a second office, really taking things to the next level." I smiled and congratulated him, genuinely happy to see him passionate about something, but also acutely aware of the growing chasm between his soaring professional success and my steady, modest contributions to the world. That awareness must have shown on my face, because his expression gradually shifted from excitement to something like irritation. "You know what?" he said, stopping his pacing to look directly at me. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about our future, about what we both want and whether we're still compatible." My heart began to race, though I wasn't sure if it was from fear or relief. "What do you mean?" He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, his hands folded in a way that reminded me of business meetings I'd watched him conduct. "I mean that I'm at a point in my life where I need a partner who matches my ambition, who understands the world I'm working in, who can contribute meaningfully to the life I'm building. And I don't think that's you anymore, Em. I don't think it ever really was." The words hung in the air between us, brutal in their honesty. Part of me wanted to fight, to defend myself, to point out all the ways I'd supported his career and sacrificed my own dreams for his success, but a larger part of me felt something unexpected, relief. Finally, we were being honest about what had been building between us for years. "So what are you saying?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm saying that I think we want different things from life. I want to build an empire, accumulate wealth, travel the world, live in luxury. You want to spend your days with 8-year-olds, talking about reading levels and playground disputes. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not compatible with where I'm headed." He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch familiar but somehow foreign. "I think we should separate, Em. I think we should both have the chance to find partners who truly understand us, who share our values and our goals. You deserve someone who thinks teaching is the most important job in the world, and I deserve someone who wants to build something big." I looked at our joined hands, remembering how safe and promising his touch had once felt. Now it felt like a goodbye, like the end of a chapter I'd been trying to rewrite for years. "And financial?" I asked, because I couldn't help but think about the practical implications of dissolving an 8-year marriage. His expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, obviously we'll need to divide things fairly. The house, the cars, the retirement account. But you have to understand, most of our assets are tied up in the business, and that's not something I can just liquidate. You'll get your share, but it's not going to be enough to maintain the lifestyle we've had." I almost laughed at the irony. The lifestyle we'd had was one where I'd been constantly reminded of my inadequate financial contributions, where I'd felt like a burden and a disappointment. The prospect of losing that lifestyle didn't terrify me the way he seemed to think it would. "I understand," I said quietly. "I never expected to be rich, Brad. I just expected to be happy." He squeezed my hand, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with 10 years earlier. "I hope you find that, Em. I really do. You're a good person, and you deserve to be happy. We're just not going to find happiness together." 2 weeks later, Brad moved out of our Scottsdale house and into a luxury high-rise downtown. The transition was surprisingly smooth, probably because we'd both been preparing for it emotionally for months. He took his clothes, his electronics, his exercise equipment, and his sense of wounded nobility. I kept the house, the memories, and the growing sense that I was finally free to discover who I might become without his constant judgment. The house felt different without him, bigger somehow, like it was expanding to accommodate possibilities I'd forgotten existed. I rearranged furniture, hung art I'd bought but never displayed, and started leaving books and papers scattered on surfaces without worrying about maintaining the perfect appearance Brad had preferred. Rachel came over the first weekend after he left, bringing wine and the kind of supportive presence that only comes from 20 years of friendship. We sat on my back patio, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple. "How are you feeling?" she asked, studying my face with the practiced concern of someone who'd watched me shrink over the years. "Relieved," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. "Scared, but relieved. Like I can finally breathe again." "Good," she said firmly. "You've been holding your breath for years and it's time to fill your lungs." I filed for divorce 3 weeks later, hiring Jennifer Chen, a family law attorney who came highly recommended for her thoroughness and her commitment to protecting her clients' interests. Jennifer was about my age, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that immediately put me at ease. "I need to understand the full scope of your marital assets," she said during our first meeting. "Bank accounts, retirement funds, business interests, real estate, investments, everything. Even things you might not think are important." I provided what I could, though I realized how little I actually knew about our financial situation. Brad had handled most of the money management, sharing only what he deemed necessary for household budgeting. I knew about our checking and savings accounts, our mortgage, and the basic outline of his business partnership, but the details had always been his domain. "What about family money?" Jennifer asked, reviewing my financial disclosure forms. "Inheritances, trusts, gifts from relatives. Just the college fund my great-aunt left me," I said, "but that was spent years ago on my education." Jennifer made a note. "I'll need documentation. Sometimes family inheritances are more complex than people realize, especially if they were managed by attorneys or financial institutions." I nodded, though I couldn't imagine what complexity could exist around Aunt Isabel's small gift. She'd lived modestly, worked hard and saved enough to help her great-niece get an education. It was generous but simple, the kind of straightforward inheritance that required no lawyers or complicated paperwork. The divorce proceedings moved slowly, bogged down by Brad's attempts to minimize the value of his business assets, and my complete lack of knowledge about our financial situation. I continued teaching, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of lesson planning and student interaction. My third graders didn't care about my personal drama, they just wanted to learn about fractions and hear stories about the adventures of their favorite book characters. It was during this period that I realized how much I'd missed the pure joy of teaching. Without Brad's constant criticism and dismissal, I rediscovered my passion for education. I started a reading club for struggling students, implemented new classroom management techniques, and even began writing a blog about innovative teaching methods. For the first time in years, I felt like I was growing instead of shrinking, but the financial reality of single life was becoming increasingly clear. Even with spousal support, I was going to have to adjust to a significantly lower standard of living. The Scottsdale house, with its pool and 3 bedrooms, would have to go. I started looking at apartments in Tempe, closer to my school, where I could afford the rent on my teacher's salary. The prospect didn't depress me the way it might have a year earlier. I was ready for a smaller, simpler life, one where I could be authentically myself without constantly measuring my worth against impossible standards. I started imagining a cozy apartment, where I could display my books openly, where I could spread out grading papers without worrying about maintaining pristine surfaces, where I could invite friends over without anxiety about whether everything looked impressive enough. 4 months into the divorce process, Jennifer called with news that would change everything. Her voice carried an excitement I'd never heard before, barely contained professional enthusiasm that immediately caught my attention. "Emily, I need you to come to my office immediately. And I mean immediately. Can you be here in an hour?" Is everything okay? I asked, glancing at the clock. It was 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and I'd just finished my last class of the day. Everything is more than okay, she said cryptically. Trust me, Emily. You're going to want to sit down for this conversation. I drove to her office with mounting curiosity and just a touch of anxiety. In my experience, urgent legal meetings were rarely good news. But Jennifer's tone had been excited rather than concerned, which gave me hope that maybe Brad had finally agreed to a fair settlement, or perhaps there was some piece of good news about our property division. Jennifer's office was in a professional building in central Phoenix, modest but well appointed, with law books lining the walls and certificates documenting her credentials. She greeted me with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face, gesturing for me to sit in the comfortable chair across from her desk. Emily, she began, opening a thick file that I didn't recognize, I've been doing some research into your family inheritance, following up on that college fund your great-aunt left you. Standard procedure in divorce cases, we need to document all assets, even historical ones. I nodded, unsure why this required an emergency meeting. Okay, but like I said, that money was spent years ago on my education. There's nothing left to document. Jennifer's smile grew even wider. That's where you're wrong. Emily, your great-aunt Isabelle Rodriguez didn't just leave you a college fund, she left you a trust, a very, very large trust. The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at her, waiting for clarification, for the punchline, for something that would help me understand what she was talking about. I don't understand. The lawyer gave me $5,000 for college, that's all there was. That was the first distribution, Jennifer explained patiently. Emily, your great-aunt was wealthy, very wealthy. She owned a chain of restaurants, commercial real estate, and had substantial investment. When she died, she left almost everything to you in a trust that was designed to protect you from fortune hunters, and to ensure you had a chance to build your own life before inheriting. I felt like I was hearing her words through water, like the meaning was there but distorted beyond recognition. That's impossible. Aunt Isabelle lived in a tiny apartment, she drove an old car, she never had any money. She lived modestly by choice, Jennifer continued, pulling out documents I'd never seen before. The trust was set up with very specific conditions. You were to receive the college fund immediately, then the full inheritance would be released when you turned 35, or in the event of a divorce, whichever came first. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. How much money are we talking about? Jennifer leaned forward, her expression serious now. Emily, you're inheriting approximately $200 million. The number hung in the air like something impossible, like a figure from a dream, or a movie. $200 million. I couldn't even conceptualize that amount of money, couldn't imagine what it looked like, or what it meant, or how it could possibly be real. That's impossible, I whispered, my voice barely audible. That can't be right. It's absolutely right, Jennifer assured me, sliding the trust documents across her desk. I've been in contact with Harold Winters, the estate attorney who's been managing your trust for the past 17 years. He's been waiting for this day, Emily. He's been managing your money, investing it, protecting it, all while you had no idea it existed. I stared at the papers, seeing my name, Aunt Isabelle's name, numbers that looked like phone numbers, but were actually dollar amounts. The trust document was thick, official, real. This wasn't a joke or a mistake or a dream. This was my life, completely transformed in the space of a single conversation. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, my voice stronger now but still shaky with disbelief. Because your great-aunt specifically designed it that way, Jennifer explained. She wanted you to have the chance to discover who you were, to build your own life, to make your own choices without the influence of enormous wealth. She wanted to protect you from people who might try to take advantage of you, and she wanted to ensure that when you did inherit, you'd be mature enough to handle it responsibly. I thought about Brad, about his constant criticism of my financial contributions, his dismissal of my career, his decision to leave me because I wasn't wealthy or ambitious enough. The irony was so profound it was almost laughable. While he'd been building his marketing empire and condescending to me about money, I'd been unknowingly sitting on a fortune that dwarfed his wildest professional dreams. Does Brad know? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not yet, Jennifer said,
with a smile that suggested she was looking forward to that revelation, but he's about to find out.
This changes everything about your divorce settlement, Emily. Everything. I left Jennifer's office in a daze, carrying copies of trust documents that proved my life had just been turned completely upside down. I drove home to my modest Scottsdale house, the same house I'd been preparing to leave for a small apartment in Tempe, and sat in my driveway staring at numbers that still didn't feel real. $200 million. I was wealthy beyond anything I'd ever imagined, beyond anything I'd ever wanted or needed or dreamed of. And Brad, the man who'd left me because I wasn't financially successful enough, was about to discover that he'd just walked away from the kind of fortune people spend their entire lives chasing. But more than the money, more than the vindication, more than the sweet irony of the situation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The profound satisfaction of knowing that Aunt Isabelle had seen something in me worth protecting, worth investing in, worth believing in. She'd known, somehow, that I would need this protection, this security, this gift of independence. As I sat in my car, holding the keys to a life I'd never imagined, I realized that the most valuable thing Aunt Isabelle had given me wasn't the money itself. It was the knowledge that I'd been worthy of love and protection all along, that someone had seen my value even when I couldn't see it myself, that the qualities Brad had dismissed as inadequate were actually the very things that had made me deserving of this incredible gift. Tomorrow, I would meet with Harold Winters and begin to understand what this inheritance really meant. Tomorrow, I would start learning how to be a woman with $200 million. Tomorrow, my life would begin again in ways I couldn't even imagine. But tonight, I just sat in my driveway watching the desert sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, and felt grateful for an aunt who'd loved me enough to protect me from a world that would have seen me very differently if they'd known what I was inheriting. She'd given me the gift of building my own identity, of discovering my own strength, of learning my own worth before the world could tell me what I was worth. And now, finally, I was ready to claim it all. The next morning, I woke up wondering if the previous day had been an elaborate dream. The trust documents were scattered across my kitchen table where I'd left them, proof that my conversation with Jennifer had actually happened. Harold Winters, the estate attorney, was expecting me at 10 o'clock at Pinnacle Wealth Management. I'd barely slept, my mind racing between disbelief and a growing sense of anticipation that felt almost foreign after years of accepting limitation. I dressed carefully in my best professional outfit, a navy blue dress I'd bought for parent-teacher conferences, paired with the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my college graduation. Looking in the mirror, I saw the same woman who'd been dismissed as financially inadequate just months ago. But something in my eyes had shifted. There was a spark of possibility there that had been dormant for far too long. The drive to downtown Phoenix felt surreal. I passed the high-rise where Brad was now living, the expensive restaurants where he'd taken his new girlfriend Vanessa, the luxury shopping centers where he'd often pointed out things we couldn't afford on my teacher's salary. Every familiar landmark seemed different now, viewed through the lens of a reality I was still struggling to comprehend. Pinnacle Wealth Management occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming office tower. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, with fresh orchids, and the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted about money. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman in her 50s, greeted me with the kind of warm professionalism that suggested she'd been expecting me. "Miss Martinez, Mr. Winters is waiting for you in his office. May I offer you coffee or tea?" I accepted the coffee, grateful for something to do with my hands. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was smooth and silent, giving me a moment to gather my thoughts. When the doors opened, I stepped into a world I'd never imagined being part of. Harold Winters was exactly what I'd expected an estate attorney to look like: distinguished silver hair, expensive suit, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But there was something else about him, a warmth that immediately put me at ease. He rose from behind his desk as I entered, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Emily, I've been waiting 17 years to meet you properly. Please, sit down. I imagine you have many questions." His office walls were lined with photographs of families, couples, individuals of all ages. I realized these were probably his clients, people whose financial legacies he'd helped preserve and protect. On his desk was a framed picture of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, probably his daughter. "Mr. Winters, I'm still trying to process all of this. Jennifer showed me the trust documents, but I don't understand how this is possible. My great-aunt lived so modestly. We never knew she had any significant wealth." Harold poured coffee from a silver service, his movements deliberate and graceful. "That was entirely intentional, Emily. Your great-aunt Isabelle was an extraordinary woman. She built her restaurant empire from nothing, starting with a single location in Tucson in the 1960s. By the time she sold the business in 1995, she owned 47 restaurants across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado." He pulled out a leather portfolio filled with photographs and documents. "She was also a remarkably astute investor. She bought commercial real estate when it was still affordable, invested in technology stocks before they became mainstream, and had an uncanny ability to identify undervalued opportunity." The photographs showed a vibrant woman in her prime, cutting ribbons at restaurant openings, shaking hands with local politicians, accepting awards from business organizations. This was a completely different Isabelle from the eccentric aunt I remembered, though I could see the same spark of intelligence in her eyes. "Why did she keep it secret from the family?" I asked, studying a picture of Isabelle standing in front of a beautiful restaurant with hand-painted tiles and wrought iron balconies. "Because she understood human nature," Harold replied. "She'd seen what sudden wealth could do to families, how it could change relationships, create expectations and dependencies. She wanted you to have the chance to become the person you were meant to be, without the influence of money." He opened another folder, this one containing detailed financial statements. "She also wanted to protect you from fortune hunters. She was quite explicit about this in her instructions. She said, and I quote, 'I want Emily to marry for love, not money. I want her to choose her career based on passion, not financial pressure. I want her to know her own worth before the world tells her what she's worth.'" Tears pricked my eyes as I heard those words. Aunt Isabelle had understood something about life that I was only beginning to grasp. She'd given me the gift of authenticity, of building my own identity without the complicating factor of enormous wealth. "The trust was structured very specifically," Harold continued, showing me charts and graphs that illustrated the growth of my inheritance over the years. "The original bequest was approximately $50 million. Through careful management and strategic investments, it's grown to just over $200 million. The numbers were staggering. I tried to imagine what $50 million looked like, let alone $200 million. Harold seemed to sense my overwhelm and leaned forward with a reassuring smile. "Emily, I know this is a lot to process, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Your great-aunt left very detailed instructions about how to help you transition into this new reality. She anticipated that you might feel overwhelmed, possibly even guilty about suddenly having so much wealth." He was right about the guilt. Even as I sat in that beautiful office, surrounded by evidence of my newfound financial security, part of me felt like I didn't deserve it. I'd done nothing to earn this money except be born into the right family. Meanwhile, my students' families struggled to afford basic school supplies, and my colleagues worked second jobs to make ends meet. "That's normal," Harold said, reading my expression. "Your great-aunt experienced the same feelings when her business became successful. She left you a letter, actually. She instructed me to give it to you when you inherited." He handed me an envelope with my name written in Isabelle's flowing script. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it and unfolded the handwritten pages inside. "My dearest Emily," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've reached the moment I've been preparing for since you were a little girl. You're probably feeling shocked, maybe guilty, possibly unworthy. I felt all of those things when I first became successful. So let me share what I learned along the way. Money is a tool, Maja. It can be used to build or destroy, to help or harm, to create opportunities or create problems. The key is remembering that you are not your money. You are the same kind, intelligent, passionate woman you were before you knew about this inheritance. The money doesn't change who you are, it simply gives you more options for expressing who you are. I chose to live modestly because I'd learned that happiness doesn't come from accumulating possessions. But I also chose to be generous, to create opportunities for others, to use my resources to make the world a little better. Now that choice is yours. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't deserve this. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for having options that others don't have. Instead, use this gift to live authentically, to pursue your passions, to help others pursue theirs. Use it to protect yourself from people who would take advantage of you, and use it to support causes and people you believe in. Most importantly, remember that the greatest inheritance I'm leaving you isn't money, it's the knowledge that you are worthy of love, respect, and all the good things life has to offer. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. With all my love and faith in your future, Aunt Isabelle. I wiped away tears as I finished reading, feeling a connection to my great-aunt that I'd never experienced while she was alive. She'd known me better than I'd known myself, had anticipated struggles I hadn't even recognized I was having. She was quite remarkable, Harold said softly. I managed her affairs for over 30 years, and I can tell you that she never made a financial decision without considering its impact on others. She was generous but not foolish, successful but not ruthless. She built something meaningful and lasting. He pulled out another set of documents, these ones detailing the current composition of my inheritance. The trust consists of several components. There's approximately $60 million in diversified investment portfolios, $40 million in commercial real estate holdings, $30 million in municipal bonds and treasury securities, and about $70 million in a variety of other investments, including art, collectibles, and some startup companies. Each category represented more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. The real estate alone included office buildings, shopping centers, and residential properties across the Southwest. The art collection contained pieces by contemporary artists, whose work I'd only seen in museums. There's also this, Harold said, producing a set of keys, your great-aunt's home in Paradise Valley. She left it to you along with everything else. It's been maintained by a property management company, but no one has lived there since she passed away. I took the keys, feeling their weight in my palm, the house I'd never seen, in a neighborhood I'd only driven through, while marveling at the mansions behind their private gates. What happens now? I asked, still feeling like I was navigating a dream. Now you take time to adjust to this new reality, Harold said. I'll arrange for you to meet with our financial planning team, our tax specialists, and our legal department. We'll help you understand your options, your responsibilities, and your opportunities. But there's no rush, Emily. This money has been managed carefully for 17 years. It can wait a little longer while you figure out what you want to do with it. The meeting lasted another 2 hours as Harold walked me through the basics of wealth management, trust administration, and tax implications. I learned about charitable giving strategies, investment philosophies, and the importance of having the right team of advisors. It was overwhelming but also oddly comforting to know that I wasn't expected to figure everything out immediately. When I finally left Pinnacle Wealth Management, I felt like I was walking into a completely different world. The Phoenix sunshine seemed brighter, the mountains more majestic, the possibilities more endless. I had the keys to a mansion in Paradise Valley, and access to more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. But first, I had to tell people. I had to figure out how to share this news with the people who mattered to me, starting with Rachel, who had been my closest friend and confidant throughout the divorce proceedings. I called her from my car parked outside the wealth management building. Rachel, are you free for lunch? I have something incredible to tell you. Of course, what's going on? You sound strange. I can't explain over the phone. Meet me at our usual place in 30 minutes. And Rachel? You might want to sit down for this conversation. Our usual place was a small cafe in Tempe, nothing fancy but comfortable and private. Rachel was already there when I arrived, her expression curious and slightly concerned. I ordered coffee and tried to figure out how to begin. Okay, you're scaring me, she said, studying my face. What's going on? Rachel, you know how I've been going through the divorce, trying to figure out how to afford an apartment on my teacher's salary. I began, my voice shaking slightly. Yes, and I've been worried about you. But you seem different today, lighter, somehow. I took a deep breath. I just came from a meeting with an estate attorney. It turns out, my great-aunt Isabelle left me a trust fund. A very large trust fund. Rachel's eyebrows rose. How large are we talking? $200 million, Rachel. 200 mil. She stared at me for a long moment, then laughed. Very funny, Em. Seriously, what's going on? I pulled out the trust documents and spread them across the table. I'm not joking. My great-aunt was wealthy, very wealthy, and she left everything to me. I had no idea. Rachel's laughter died as she examined the papers, her expression shifting from amusement to shock to something approaching awe. Emily, this is real. These are real legal documents. You're rich. Like seriously, rich. I know. I'm still trying to process it myself. Wait, she said, her voice growing excited. Brad left you because you weren't financially successful enough. He called you a burden, said you'd never amount to anything, and now you're worth more than he could make in 100 lifetimes. The irony wasn't lost on me. The trust was set up so that I'd inherit when I turned 35 or got divorced, whichever came first. If Brad had stayed married to me for 3 more years, he would have been part of this. Instead, he walked away because I wasn't wealthy enough. Rachel leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in amazement. This is like something out of a movie. Does he know? Not yet, but he's about to find out. The divorce settlement will be very different now. We spent the next hour talking through the implications, the opportunities, the challenges that come with sudden wealth. Rachel asked practical questions about taxes and investments, but also deeper questions about how this would change my identity, my relationships, my future. The thing is, I said, I don't feel different. I still want to teach, still care about my students, still believe in the importance of education. The money doesn't change who I am, but it changes what you can do, Rachel pointed out. You could fund entire school programs, provide scholarships, create opportunities for kids who need them. You could make a real difference in education. She was right. The money didn't change my values, but it gave me the power to act on them in ways I'd never imagined. I could support causes I believed in, help people who needed it, create positive change in my community. After lunch, I drove to Paradise Valley to see the house I'd inherited. The neighborhood was even more impressive than I'd remembered, with sprawling estates, hidden behind high walls, and lush landscaping. I followed the GPS to an address I'd never visited, pulling up to a gate that opened automatically. When I pressed the code Harold had given me, the driveway wound through mature desert landscaping, with towering saguaro cacti and ocotillo plants creating a natural sculpture garden. When the house came into view, I had to stop the car for a moment to take it in. It was magnificent without being ostentatious, a southwestern architectural masterpiece that seemed to grow organically from the desert landscape. The structure was all clean lines and natural materials, with walls of glass that captured the mountain views, and courtyards that created intimate outdoor spaces. I used the key Harold had given me to unlock the front door, stepping into a foyer with soaring ceilings and a skylight that bathed everything in golden light. The house was furnished but felt frozen in time, as if Isabelle had just stepped out for a moment and would return at any second. Her personality was everywhere, in the vibrant textiles draped over furniture, in the collection of pottery and artwork displayed throughout the rooms, in the kitchen filled with professional-grade appliances, and cookbooks in both English and Spanish. This was the home of a woman who had lived fully, who had surrounded herself with beauty and comfort, while maintaining a connection to her cultural heritage. I wandered through room after room, each one revealing more about the aunt I'd never really known. Her office contained awards and accolades from business organizations, photographs with mayors and governors, evidence of a life lived with purpose and impact. Her bedroom was simple but elegant, with French doors opening onto a private garden, but it was the library that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in multiple languages, comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the natural light, and a writing desk where Isabelle had apparently spent time crafting letters and managing her affairs. On the desk, in a silver frame, was a photograph of me, at my college graduation, smiling and confident, full of hope for the future. I picked up the photograph, remembering that day. Isabelle had been there, had hugged me afterward, and told me how proud she was of my accomplishment.
At the time I'd thought she was just being kind. Now I realized she'd been looking at me as her heir, the person who would carry on her legacy of generosity and purpose. That evening, I sat in Isabelle's garden, as the sun set over the mountains, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had happened. In the space of 24 hours, my entire life had been transformed. I was no longer Emily Martinez, the struggling teacher going through a difficult divorce. I was Emily Martinez, philanthropist, businesswoman, woman of substantial means. But more than that, I was finally free to be authentically myself without apology or compromise. For years I'd been shrinking to fit into Brad's vision of what I should be, accepting his judgments about my worth and my contribution. Now I had the resources to pursue my passions, to support causes I believed in, to help others in ways I'd never imagined possible. I called Jennifer Chen the next morning to discuss how the trust fund would impact our divorce strategy. Her voice was practically gleeful as she explained the legal implications. Emily, this changes everything. Brad's attorney has been arguing that you deserve minimal support because of your limited earning capacity. Now we can demonstrate that you have substantial assets that were always yours, that you brought significant value to the marriage even if it wasn't apparent at the time. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means Brad's claim to half of the marital assets becomes much smaller proportionally. It means his argument about your financial inadequacy becomes laughable. It means he's about to discover that he just walked away from the wealthiest woman he'll ever meet. That afternoon, Jennifer arranged for Brad's attorney to be notified of the trust fund. She called me an hour later, barely able to contain her laughter. Emily, you should have heard the phone call. Brad's attorney couldn't believe it. He kept asking if there was some mistake, if the documents were legitimate. When I assured him everything was properly documented, he asked for time to consult with his client. How do you think Brad will react? I asked. I think he's going to be very, very sorry he ever called you a financial burden. The call came that evening. Brad's name appeared on my phone screen, and I let it ring several times before answering. His voice was strained, completely different from the confident tone he'd used when he'd announced he was leaving me. Emily, we need to talk. Can I come over? I don't think that's a good idea, Brad. We're in the middle of divorce proceedings. Any communication should go through our attorney. Please, this is important. I just found out about your inheritance. I had no idea. We need to discuss what this means for our future. The presumption in his voice was staggering. He'd left me 6 months ago, had been living with another woman, had spent our entire marriage making me feel inadequate about money. Now that he knew I was wealthy, he wanted to discuss our future. Brad, you made it very clear that we don't have a future together. You said I wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't financially successful enough, wasn't the kind of partner you needed. Nothing about that has changed. But Emily, I didn't know about the trust fund. If I'd known, things would have been different. Exactly, I said quietly. If you'd known I was wealthy, you would have treated me differently. You would have valued me differently. But I'm the same person I was 6 months ago, Brad. The only thing that's changed is your perception of my worth. There was silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. I made a mistake, Em. I see that now. I was so focused on building my career, on accumulating wealth, that I lost sight of what really mattered. I lost sight of you. You didn't lose sight of me, Brad. You never really saw me in the first place. You saw a teacher who didn't make enough money, who wasn't ambitious enough, who wasn't worthy of your respect. The money doesn't change who I am, or who you are. Can we at least meet for coffee? Can we talk about this in person? I considered his request, weighing my curiosity about his reaction against the risk of reopening old wounds. I'll think about it, Brad, but not right now. I need time to process everything that's happened. After hanging up, I sat in my Scottsdale kitchen, looking around at the house I'd been preparing to leave. Everything looked different now, not because the physical space had changed, but because my relationship to it had transformed. I could stay here if I wanted, could buy a dozen houses like this one, could live anywhere in the world, but more importantly, I could finally make choices based on what I wanted, rather than what I could afford. I could teach because I loved it, not because I needed the income. I could support causes I believed in, could help students who needed resources, could create the kind of positive impact I'd always dreamed of making. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings with financial advisors, tax attorneys, and investment specialists. I learned about charitable foundations, about socially responsible investing, about the complex world of wealth management, but I also continued teaching, continued grading papers and planning lessons, continued being the person I'd always been. My students had no idea their teacher was now worth more than most Fortune 500 executives. To them, I was still Miss Martinez, the teacher who helped them with math problems, and listened to their stories about weekend adventure. That consistency grounded me, reminded me of who I was beyond the numbers in my bank account. I also began to understand what Isabelle had meant about money being a tool. I quietly paid off the student loans of 3 young teachers at my school, donated new computers to the library, and established a fund to provide supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. The ability to help others, to solve problems with resources, rather than just good intentions, was intoxicating, but it was also isolating. I found myself hesitating to share details of my new life with colleagues, worried about how it might change our relationship. I was still the same person, but I knew others might see me differently, if they knew about the inheritance. 3 weeks after the trust fund revelation, I finally agreed to meet Brad for coffee. We met at a neutral location, a cafe in Central Phoenix, that neither of us had any history with. He looked different, somehow smaller, less confident, than the man who had walked out of our marriage with such certainty. "You look good, Em," he said as we sat down with our drinks. Different, more, I don't know how to describe it. "I look the same as always, Brad. The only thing that's changed is your perception." He winced at the accuracy of my observation. "I deserve that. I deserve a lot worse than that, actually. Emily, I owe you an apology, a big one. I'm listening. I was wrong about everything. About you, about what matters, about what success looks like. I was so caught up in accumulating wealth and status that I lost sight of the person I married. I lost sight of why I fell in love with you in the first place." "And why was that?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because you were authentic, because you cared about things that mattered, because you weren't impressed by money, or status, or any of the superficial things that I thought were important. You were real, Emily. You were the most real person I'd ever met." "I'm still that person, Brad. I still teach 3rd grade, still care about my students, still believe that education is important work. The money doesn't change any of that. I know that now, but I didn't know it then. I thought success was about accumulating wealth, about building an empire, about being seen as important. I thought your teaching was holding us back, limiting our potential. And now I realize that you were already successful. You were making a difference in the world, touching lives, building something meaningful. I was the one who was limited, who couldn't see past dollar signs, to recognize real value." I studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there, but also something else. "Brad, are you apologizing because you realized you were wrong, or because you found out I'm wealthy?" He was quiet for a long moment, struggling with honesty. "Both, I think. Finding out about the trust fund made me realize how badly I'd misjudged you, but it also made me realize what I'd lost, what I'd walked away from." "You didn't walk away from money, Brad. You walked away from me, from us, from the possibility of building something real together." "I know, and I'm asking if there's any chance we could try again, if we could start over, knowing what we know now." I set down my coffee cup and looked at him directly. "Brad, let me ask you something. If I had never inherited this money, if I was still just a teacher going through a divorce, would you be here asking for another chance?" He started to answer quickly, then stopped, recognizing the trap of his own honesty. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'd like to think yes, but I honestly don't know." "That's your answer then. You're not asking for me back, Brad. You're asking for access to my money, and that's exactly what Aunt Isabelle was trying to protect me from." "That's not fair, Em. My feelings for you aren't about money, aren't they? You left me because I wasn't wealthy enough. Now you want me back because I am wealthy enough. How is that not about money?" He had no answer for that, because we both knew it was true. The Brad, who had walked out of our marriage, would never have asked for a second chance with a broke schoolteacher, but the Brad sitting across from me was very interested in reconciling with a woman worth $200 million. "I loved you, Emily. I still love you." "No, Brad. You loved the idea of me when I fit into your vision of what a wife should be."
You loved having someone who would support your ambitions without competing with them. You loved having someone who would make you feel successful by comparison, but you never loved me for who I actually am. How can you say that? 'Cause when I was struggling, when I needed support, when I was vulnerable, you walked away. You didn't just leave me, Brad. You kicked me when I was down. You made me feel worthless, inadequate, like I was the problem in our marriage. Tears were running down my face now, not from sadness, but from the release of finally saying what I'd needed to say for months. A person who loves you doesn't abandon you when you're struggling. They don't make you feel small or inadequate. They don't dismiss your dreams or diminish your achievements. I'm sorry, Em. I'm so sorry. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't take that back. But people change. I've changed. Have you? Or have you just changed your assessment of my net worth? He sat back in his chair, finally understanding that this conversation wasn't going to end the way he'd hoped. So that's it? There's no chance for us? Brad, the chance for us ended when you decided I wasn't valuable enough to fight for. The money doesn't change that. It just makes it clearer. I stood up to leave, then turned back for one final thought. You know what the saddest part is? If you had stayed, if you had supported me through the rough patch, if you had valued me for who I am instead of what I earn, you would have been part of this. We would have discovered the inheritance together, as partners. Instead, you chose to leave, and now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. As I walked to my car, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The conversation hadn't been about revenge or vindication. It had been about finally speaking my truth, about standing up for my own worth, about refusing to accept less than I deserved. That evening, I called Harold Winters to discuss my plans for the inheritance. I was ready to start thinking about the future, about how to use this gift to create positive change in the world. I want to establish a foundation, I told him. Something focused on education, on supporting teachers and students who need resources. I want to use this money to make a real difference. That's exactly what your great-aunt would have wanted, Harold said warmly. She always said the best inheritances are the ones that keep giving long after the original beneficiary is gone. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Aunt Isabelle had given me more than money. She'd given me the freedom to be authentically myself, the security to make choices based on my values rather than my fears, and the power to create positive change in the world. But most importantly, she'd given me the knowledge that I was worthy of love and respect exactly as I was. The money was just a tool to help me express that worth in ways that matter. 3 months after discovering my inheritance, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Martinez Foundation, watching architects present designs for our first educational resource center. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the conference table was worth more than my annual teaching salary had been, yet here I was, planning to give away millions to support the very profession Brad had dismissed as insignificant. The foundation had become my primary focus outside of teaching. Working with Harold Winters and a team of nonprofit specialists, we'd structured an organization dedicated to supporting educational initiatives across Arizona. Our first major project was ambitious, a comprehensive resource center in South Phoenix that would provide tutoring, college preparation, and family support services to underserved communities. The design incorporates natural light throughout the learning spaces, the lead architect explained, pointing to the building plans spread across the table. We've included flexible classroom configurations, a technology lab, a library with community meeting spaces, and administrative offices for staff and volunteers. I studied the renderings, imagining the students who would benefit from these resources. The center would serve the same neighborhoods where I'd grown up, where kids like me had dreams bigger than their circumstances, but lacked the support systems to pursue them effectively. What's the total cost estimate? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be well within our budget. Approximately $12 million for construction and initial setup, with annual operating costs of around $2 million, the architect replied. That includes staffing, programming, utilities, and ongoing maintenance. $12 million. The amount would have been incomprehensible to me just months ago, representing more money than I could have imagined possessing. Now it was simply the cost of creating something meaningful, something that would outlast my own lifetime and continue serving students for generations. Let's move forward with the design, I said, feeling the familiar thrill of making decisions that would create positive change. I'd like to schedule community input sessions to ensure we're meeting the actual needs of the families we'll serve. After the meeting, I drove to Desert View Elementary for my afternoon classes. The transition between my two worlds had become surprisingly natural. In the morning, I might be discussing million-dollar donations and foundation strategy. In the afternoon, I was helping 8-year-olds understand fractions and mediating playground disputes. My students had no idea their teacher was now one of the wealthiest women in Arizona. To them, I was still Martinez, the teacher who kept extra snacks in her desk drawer and stayed after school to help with homework. That consistency grounded me, reminded me that my fundamental identity hadn't changed, despite the dramatic shift in my circumstances. Martinez, my mom wanted me to give you this, said Sophia, one of my quieter students, handing me a carefully folded note during lunch recess. I opened the note to find a message in Spanish from Sophia's mother, expressing gratitude for the extra time I'd been spending with her daughter on reading skills. The note was written on the back of what appeared to be a past-due utility bill, a reminder of the financial pressures many of my students' families face daily. That afternoon, I made a note to have the Foundation's Family Services Coordinator reach out to Sophia's family. We'd developed a discretionary fund for families experiencing financial hardship, providing assistance with utilities, rent, and basic necessities. The help was offered through the school's existing support systems, ensuring families received aid without stigma or complicated application process. These small interventions had become one of the most rewarding aspects of my new reality. The ability to solve problems with resources rather than just sympathy felt like a superpower. A family facing eviction could be helped with emergency rental assistance. A student who needed glasses could receive them the next day. A talented teenager lacking funds for college application fees could pursue their dreams without financial barriers. But the wealth had also brought unexpected challenges. I'd learned to be careful about sharing details of my weekend activities with colleagues, knowing that casual mentions of art gallery openings or charity galas might create distance in relationships that had always been based on shared financial struggles. The isolation was subtle but real. When teachers in the break room complained about car repairs or utility bills, I found myself staying quiet, unable to relate to financial stress that had once been my constant companion. I missed the easy camaraderie of shared struggle, the way we'd all understood each other's constraints and limitations. Emily, you've been different lately, commented Janet, a fellow third-grade teacher, as we supervised after-school dismissal. Happier, but also more distant somehow. Is everything okay with the divorce? I considered how to answer honestly without revealing the full truth. The divorce is final, which is a relief. I think I'm just figuring out who I am as a single person again. That makes sense. You seem more confident, more sure of yourself. It's good to see you standing taller. Janet was right about the confidence. Knowing I had financial security had freed me from the constant low-level anxiety that had characterized my marriage. I no longer worried about unexpected expenses or whether I could afford basic necessities. That freedom had translated into a more assertive, authentic version of myself. The divorce proceedings had concluded with surprising swiftness once the trust fund was revealed. Brad's demands for spousal support and half of our marital assets had been quietly withdrawn when his attorney explained the mathematical reality of our new financial dynamic. He'd ultimately received a modest settlement that allowed him to maintain his downtown lifestyle while I retained the house and most of our shared assets. The final divorce hearing had been almost anticlimactic. Brad had attended with his new girlfriend Vanessa, though she'd seemed less enthusiastic about their relationship once the local society pages had reported on my inheritance. Apparently, being the girlfriend of a divorced marketing executive was less appealing than being the girlfriend of a man married to a wealthy heiress. The decree is final, Judge Martinez had announced, the coincidence of sharing my maiden name, not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The court wishes both parties success in their future endeavors. I'd walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years. The legal end of my marriage marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could pursue my passions without apology or compromise. That evening, I'd celebrated quietly with Rachel at a small restaurant in Tempe. We'd ordered wine and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of freedom. "I'm proud of you, Em," Rachel had said, raising her glass in a "You could have let Brad's treatment define you, could have accepted his version of your worth. Instead, you've become the strongest version of yourself." "I had help," I'd replied, thinking of Aunt Isabel's letter and the protection her foresight had provided. "But I think I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be." The foundation work had introduced me to Phoenix's philanthropic community, a world I'd never imagined being part of. Monthly donor meetings and charity events had become regular parts of my calendar, connecting me with other people who used their resources to create positive change. At first, I'd felt like an imposter in these circles. Unlike many of the other philanthropists who'd inherited wealth from childhood or built fortunes over decades, I was still adjusting to my new reality. But I'd gradually found my voice, discovering that my background in education and my recent experience with financial struggle gave me unique insights into the challenges facing our community. "Emily, I'd like you to meet David Chen," said Margaret Williams, the director of the Phoenix Children's Foundation during a fundraising gala at the Arizona Biltmore. "David is developing innovative programs for after-school enrichment in underserved communities." David was about my age, with kind eyes and an easy smile that reminded me of my favorite college professors. He worked for a nonprofit that provided STEM education opportunities for students who wouldn't otherwise have access to advanced learning resources. "Margaret tells me you're establishing an educational foundation," he said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "That's exciting. Are you focusing on any particular aspect of education?" "Comprehensive support," I replied, grateful for the opportunity to discuss my passion project. "We're looking at everything from basic literacy and numeracy skills to college preparation and family support services. The idea is to address the whole ecosystem that affects student success." "That's ambitious and smart." Too many programs focus on isolated interventions without considering the broader context. Students can't learn effectively if they're hungry, if their families are facing eviction, if they don't have a quiet place to study. David's understanding of the challenges facing students impressed me. Unlike many people in philanthropic circles who approached charity as a distant concept, he clearly had direct experience with the communities we were trying to serve. "What drew you to this work?" I asked, genuinely curious about his background. "I grew up in similar circumstances to many of the kids we serve," he said simply. "Single mother, limited resources, schools that were doing their best but lacked adequate funding. I was lucky enough to have a few teachers who saw my potential and helped me access opportunities I wouldn't have found on my own. And now you're creating those opportunities for other students." "Exactly. It's not about charity in the traditional sense. It's about justice, about ensuring that talent and hard work are rewarded regardless of family income or zip code." I found myself drawn to David's perspective, his combination of idealism and pragmatism. He understood both the systemic challenges facing education and the practical steps needed to address them. As the evening progressed, we continued our conversation, comparing notes on effective intervention strategies and sharing stories about students who'd overcome significant obstacles to achieve their goals. "Would you be interested in visiting some of our programs?" David asked as the gala was winding down. "I'd love to show you what we're doing, and I'd welcome your input on how we might expand or improve our services." I accepted his invitation, intrigued by the possibility of learning from established programs before launching our own initiative. The following week, David picked me up at the foundation office for a tour of 3 different after-school sites across Phoenix. The first location was in a converted warehouse in South Phoenix, where 60 students ranging from elementary to high school age worked on everything from basic homework help to advanced robotics projects. The space was bright and energetic, with student artwork covering the walls and the sound of engaged learning filling the air. "This is Maria," David said, introducing me to a high school junior who was programming a robot to navigate an obstacle course. "She's planning to study engineering at Arizona State next year." Maria beamed with pride as she demonstrated her robot's capabilities. "I never thought I'd be good at this stuff," she said, "but Miss Chen showed me that math and science are just tools for solving problems, and I'm really good at solving problems." "What kind of problems do you want to solve?" I asked, impressed by her confidence and enthusiasm.
I want to design systems that help people, she replied without hesitation. Like maybe water purification systems for communities that don't have clean water, or renewable energy systems for rural areas. I want to use engineering to make the world better. Her answer reminded me of why I'd been drawn to teaching in the first place. The opportunity to help young people discover their potential and pursue their dreams was infinitely more valuable than any material possession. The second site was located in a community center in central Phoenix, serving primarily elementary-age students. Here, the focus was on foundational skills like reading and basic mathematics, but also on social-emotional learning and family engagement. We've found that academic support alone isn't enough, David explained as we watched students working in small groups with volunteer tutors. These kids need to develop confidence, learn how to manage emotions, and build relationships with caring adults. We also need to support their families, because parents are their children's first teacher. I observed a group of second graders working on a reading comprehension exercise, their faces serious with concentration. One little boy struggled with a particular word and his tutor patiently helped him sound it out, celebrating his success with genuine enthusiasm. That's exactly what we're seeing in our foundation planning, I said to David. Academic achievement is connected to so many other factors: housing stability, food security, family stress levels, access to healthcare. You can't address education in isolation. Right. And that's why your comprehensive approach is so promising. Most funders want to support programs that show immediate, measurable results, but the most important work often takes years to bear fruit. The third site was the newest, located in a renovated elementary school in West Phoenix. This location served primarily high school students, offering advanced courses not available at their home schools, college preparation services, and internship opportunities with local businesses. This is where we see the most dramatic impact, David said as we walked through a chemistry lab, where students were conducting experiments that would have been impossible at their under-resourced home school. These kids are academically capable, but they've been limited by lack of access to rigorous coursework. I watched a group of teenagers collaborating on a complex chemistry project, their discussion filled with technical vocabulary and sophisticated reasoning. Without this program, these students would have been relegated to basic courses that didn't challenge their intellectual capabilities. How do you measure success? I asked, thinking about the foundation's need to demonstrate impact to donors and board members. Multiple ways, David replied. Obviously, we track academic metrics like grade point averages and standardized test scores, but we also look at college enrollment rates, scholarship awards, and longer-term outcomes like career placement and civic engagement. And what are you seeing? 93% of our high school participants graduate on time, compared to 78% district-wide. 87% enroll in post-secondary education, compared to 62% district-wide. But more importantly, our alumni are coming back as mentors and volunteers, creating a cycle of community investment. The statistics were impressive, but what struck me more was the culture David had created. Students weren't just receiving services, they were being empowered to become leaders and changemakers in their own communities. After the tour, we stopped for coffee at a cafe near the foundation office. I wanted to discuss potential collaboration opportunities and learn more about David's approach to nonprofit management. I'm curious about your funding model, I said as we settled into a quiet corner booth. How do you sustain programs at this scale? It's a constant challenge, David admitted. We have a mix of foundation grants, corporate sponsorships, individual donations, and some fee-for-service contracts with school districts. The goal is to diversify revenue streams, so we're not dependent on any single source. What about sustainability? How do you ensure programs continue even if funding fluctuates? Community ownership is key. We train local residents to become program coordinators and volunteer leaders. We also work with schools and community organizations to integrate our services into existing structure. The idea is to build capacity that can survive changes in external funding. I was impressed by David's strategic thinking. Unlike many nonprofit leaders who focused solely on program delivery, he understood the importance of building sustainable systems that could adapt to changing circumstances. The Martinez Foundation is planning to make significant multi-year commitments, I said, testing his reaction. We're less interested in short-term projects than in creating lasting change. What would you do with guaranteed funding for, say, 10 years? David's eyes lit up with excitement. 10 years? That would be transformational. We could expand to serve twice as many students, develop comprehensive programming from elementary through high school, and create pipeline partnerships with colleges and employers. Tell me more about the pipeline concept. Right now, we're primarily focused on keeping students on track for graduation and college enrollment, but we're not doing enough to ensure they succeed once they get there, or to connect them with meaningful career opportunities after graduation. David pulled out his phone and showed me a diagram he'd been working on. Imagine a comprehensive support system that follows students from elementary school through college and into their career. Academic support, mentorship, internships, scholarship assistance, career counseling, and ongoing professional development. That's exactly what we're envisioning, I said, feeling a growing sense of excitement about potential collaboration. A holistic approach that addresses the full spectrum of factors that affect student success. The challenge is scale and coordination. You need significant resources to implement programming at that level, and you need strong partnerships with schools, colleges, and employers. What if resources weren't a limiting factor? I asked carefully. What if you could focus on program design and implementation without worrying about fundraising? David studied my face, clearly trying to read between the lines. That would be ideal, but it's not realistic for most nonprofits. Even well-funded organizations have to spend significant time and energy on resource development. What if I told you the Martinez Foundation was prepared to make a $20 million commitment over 10 years to support exactly the kind of comprehensive programming you're describing? David's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. 20 million? Are you serious? Completely serious. We're looking for partners who share our vision of comprehensive, sustainable support for students and families. Your organization has the experience and track record we're looking for. Emily, that would be incredible, life-changing for thousands of students, but I have to ask, where is this funding coming from? The Martinez Foundation is new, and this level of commitment is unusual for individual donors. I'd been expecting this question and had prepared an honest but measured response. I recently received a substantial inheritance from a family member who believed in the power of education to transform lives. She specifically wanted her resources used to create opportunities for students who might not otherwise have access to them. That's amazing. Your family member sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, and I'm committed to honoring her vision by creating something that will outlast both of us. David leaned back in his chair, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was proposing. This could change everything, not just for our organization, but for the entire educational landscape in Phoenix. That's the goal, but I want to make sure we're doing this right. I don't want to just throw money at problems. I want to create sustainable solutions that address root causes. I appreciate that approach. Too many well-intentioned donors focus on quick fixes or visible projects, rather than the longer-term work that actually creates change. We spent the next hour discussing implementation strategies, partnership opportunities, and measurement framework. David's combination of vision and pragmatism impressed me, and I could see that he shared my commitment to creating lasting change, rather than just feel-good programs. I'd like to propose a formal partnership between the Martinez Foundation and your organization, I said as our conversation was winding down. We could structure it as a strategic alliance, where we provide significant funding in exchange for shared governance of program design and implementation. I'd be honored to explore that possibility, David replied, but I want to make sure we're aligned on values and approach. Money is important, but partnership is about more than just financial support. Agreed. What would you need to feel confident about moving forward? I'd like you to meet our board of directors and program staff. I'd also like to spend time with your foundation team to understand your organizational culture and decision-making processes. That sounds perfect. Let's schedule a series of meetings over the next few weeks. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the day's conversations and the potential for meaningful collaboration. David's program represented exactly the kind of impact I wanted to create through the foundation. His focus on comprehensive support, community ownership and sustainable systems, aligned perfectly with my vision for educational philanthropy. But more than that, I'd found someone who shared my values and understood the complexities of creating lasting change. The partnership we were discussing would be more than a funding relationship. It would be a true collaboration based on shared commitment to serving students and families. That night, I called Harold Winters to discuss the proposed partnership and its implications for the Foundation's strategic direction. "It sounds like an excellent opportunity," Harold said after I'd outlined the conversation with Dave. "The due diligence process will be important, but partnerships with established organizations can be much more effective than starting from scratch. What should I be looking for during the evaluation process?" "Financial stability, board governance, program effectiveness, and culture alignment. You want to make sure their values and operating style are compatible with yours. And what about the funding commitment? Is $20 million over 10 years reasonable?" "For an organization with David's track record, it's actually conservative. The programs you're describing could easily absorb twice that amount if you wanted to expand more aggressively." The following week, I attended David's board meeting to present the partnership proposal. The board members were an impressive group of community leaders, educators, and business professionals who clearly cared deeply about the organization's mission. "This partnership would allow us to expand our impact exponentially," David explained to the board. "But it would also require us to grow our capacity, strengthen our systems, and take on significantly more responsibility." "What are the risks?" asked Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, a retired school superintendent who served as board chair. "The primary risk is dependency," David replied honestly. "If we build programs around this level of funding and then lose it, we could face serious operational challenges. That's why we're proposing a 10-year commitment, with built-in sustainability planning. The goal is to use this partnership to build organizational capacity that can survive beyond any single funding source." The board asked thoughtful questions about oversight, evaluation, and long-term sustainability. I was impressed by their sophisticated understanding of nonprofit management and their commitment to responsible stewardship of resources. "We'll need to vote on this proposal," Dr. Gonzalez said after an hour of discussion. "But I can tell you that the board is excited about the possibility of this partnership." 2 weeks later, David called with the news that the board had unanimously approved the partnership proposal. "We're in," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is going to be incredible, Emily." The formal partnership agreement took another month to negotiate, with lawyers on both sides working to ensure appropriate oversight and accountability measures. But by the end of the year, the Martinez Foundation and David's organization had launched the most comprehensive educational support program in Phoenix's history. The announcement generated significant media attention, with local newspapers and television stations reporting on the partnership and its potential impact. For the first time since discovering the inheritance, I found myself in the spotlight, explaining my vision for educational philanthropy to reporters and community leaders. "Education is the great equalizer," I said during a television interview. "Every child deserves access to high-quality learning opportunities, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. This partnership is about ensuring that talent and hard work are rewarded, not limited by zip code or income level." The publicity brought both opportunities and challenge. Other organizations began approaching the foundation for funding, and I found myself fielding requests for meetings and proposals on a daily basis.
The attention also brought scrutiny, with some people questioning whether a recently divorced teacher was qualified to manage such substantial resources. But the criticism only strengthened my resolve. I'd spent years having my capabilities questioned and my contributions minimized. Now I had the resources and platform to prove that my vision for educational change was both valid and viable. The partnership with David's organization became the Foundation's flagship program, but it was just the beginning. Over the following months, we launched additional initiatives focused on teacher professional development, family support services, and college scholarship programs. Each new program brought me deeper into Phoenix's educational ecosystem, connecting me with superintendents, principals, teachers, and families who shared my commitment to student success. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply fulfilling, in ways that Brad had never understood. The irony wasn't lost on me that the career he'd dismissed as insignificant had become the foundation for philanthropic work that would affect thousands of lives. The teaching experience he'd seen as limiting had given me the insights and credibility needed to create meaningful change in education. But more than that, the values he'd criticized as naive, my belief in the importance of education, my commitment to helping others, my preference for meaningful work over financial gain, had turned out to be exactly the qualities needed to manage substantial wealth responsibly. As I stood in my office at the foundation, looking out at the Phoenix skyline and thinking about the students who would benefit from our programs, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The pain of my marriage's collapse had been necessary to discover my own strength. The humiliation of being dismissed as financially inadequate had motivated me to prove that worth isn't measured in dollars alone. And Aunt Isabelle's gift had given me not just financial resources, but the freedom to pursue my authentic purpose without compromise or apology. I was finally living the life I was meant to live, using my talents and resources to create the kind of positive change I'd always believed was possible. The woman who'd been called a financial burden was now responsible for managing one of Arizona's largest educational foundations. The teacher who'd been told she'd never amount to anything was now creating opportunities for thousands of students to exceed their own expectations. It was a transformation that went far beyond money, far beyond revenge or vindication. It was about discovering that my authentic self, the self Brad had found so inadequate, was exactly who I needed to be to make a meaningful difference in the world. 6 months after the Martinez Foundation's launch, I found myself standing before the Phoenix City Council, presenting our comprehensive proposal for educational reform across the district's most underserved schools. The council chambers were packed with community members, educators, and local media, all gathered to hear about what many were calling the most ambitious philanthropic initiative in the city's history. Honorable Mayor and council members, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was proposing. The Martinez Foundation is requesting permission to pilot an integrated support model in 10 elementary schools across Phoenix. This isn't just about funding. It's about fundamentally reimagining how we support student success. The presentation boards behind me displayed detailed plans for wraparound services that would transform these schools into true community hubs. Each site would offer not only enhanced academic programming, but also health clinics, family counseling services, adult education classes, and job training programs. The goal was to address every barrier that prevented students from reaching their full potential. Councilwoman Patricia Rodriguez leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Ms. Martinez, the scope of what you're proposing is unprecedented. Can you walk us through the financial commitment the foundation is making? $50 million over 5 years, I replied, watching the impact of that number ripple through the chamber. $10 million per year distributed across 10 schools with comprehensive evaluation and community input built into every phase of implementation. The murmur of surprised voices filled the room. Even I sometimes struggled to believe the figures I was discussing, remembering not so long ago when a $5 lunch had been a budget consideration. But Aunt Isabelle's wisdom echoed in my mind. Money was simply a tool, and I was learning to wield it with precision and purpose. Mayor James Mitchell, a former educator himself, asked the question I'd been expecting. This is an extraordinary commitment, Ms. Martinez. What assurance do we have that the foundation will be able to sustain this level of investment? The Martinez Foundation's endowment exceeds $200 million, I replied. This initiative represents approximately 1/4 of our available resources, leaving substantial reserves for other programs and long-term sustainability. We're not asking the city to depend on us indefinitely, but rather to partner with us in proving that comprehensive support works, so these models can be replicated and scaled. Harold Winters had coached me on this presentation, helping me understand that credibility in philanthropic circles required demonstrating both vision and fiscal responsibility. The foundation's board, which now included respected community leaders like Patricia Gonzalez and David Chen, had spent months developing implementation plans that balanced ambition with pragmatism. The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from oversight mechanisms to community engagement strategy. I answered each one drawing from months of research, site visits to successful programs in other cities, and countless conversations with educators, parents, and students. What makes you confident this approach will work where other reform efforts have struggled? asked Councilman Robert Davis, whose skeptical tone suggested he'd seen many well-intentioned initiatives fail to deliver promised results. Because we're not imposing solutions from the outside, I replied. Every component of these programs has been developed in partnership with the communities they'll serve. We've spent the past 6 months conducting focus groups with parents, teachers, and students in each target neighborhood. This isn't about what we think these communities need. It's about supporting what they've told us they need. The community engagement process had been one of the most rewarding aspects of planning the initiative. Unlike my marriage, where my voice had been consistently diminished, the foundation work had taught me the importance of listening to and amplifying other voices, particularly those that were often overlooked in policy discussion. After the council presentation, I met with a group of parents from the 10 target schools. These were the families who would be most directly affected by our programs, and their input was crucial to ensuring successful implementation. My daughter Maria is in 2nd grade at Desert Bloom Elementary, said Carmen Gutierrez, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children. She's smart, but she struggles with reading, and I don't know how to help her. I never finished high school myself. Carmen's story resonated deeply with me, reminding me of my own mother's struggles to support my education despite her own limited formal schooling. The difference was that Carmen would have access to resources that hadn't existed when I was growing up. The Literacy Support Program will provide both individual tutoring for Maria and family literacy classes for you, I explained. Research shows that when parents develop their own skills alongside their children, both benefit dramatically, and this is really I'd asked another parent, Roberto Sanchez, whose wariness reflected years of being promised help that came with hidden costs or complicated requirements. Completely free, I assured him. No applications, no income verification, no waiting list. If your child attends one of our partner schools, they have access to every service we provide. The simplicity of access had been a deliberate choice. Too many support programs were undermined by bureaucratic barriers that prevented the families who needed help most from actually receiving it. The Foundation's resources allowed us to eliminate those obstacles entirely. Maria Santos, a high school junior whose younger siblings would benefit from the elementary programs, asked a question that got to the heart of our long-term vision. What happens when we graduate? Do these programs follow us to middle school and high school? That's exactly what we're working toward, I replied. This elementary pilot is the first phase of a comprehensive pipeline that will eventually support students from kindergarten through college and career placement. The pipeline concept had evolved from my conversations with David Chen and had become central to the Foundation's strategic vision. Rather than providing isolated interventions at specific grade levels, we were designing a system that would support students throughout their entire educational journey. Over the following weeks, I spent countless hours visiting the 10 pilot schools, meeting with principals, teachers, and support staff who would be implementing our program. Each school had its own culture, challenges, and strengths, requiring customized approaches that honored local contexts while maintaining program integrity. At Rosa Parks Elementary, Principal Jennifer Lopez showed me around classrooms, where 35 students crowded into spaces designed for 20. The academic programming you're proposing is wonderful, she said, but honestly, what we need most urgently is more physical space and basic supply. We can address both, I replied, making notes about infrastructure improvements that could be funded through the Foundation's facilities allocation. What if we could add modular classrooms and fully stock every classroom with materials teachers need? That would be transformational, Principal Lopez replied, her voice filled with a hope I recognized. It was the same hope I'd felt when supportive administrators had believed in my teaching innovations despite resource constraints. The conversation reminded me that effective philanthropy required flexibility and responsiveness to emerging needs. Our detailed plans were important, but they had to remain adaptable to the realities educators face daily. At Washington Elementary, I met with 2nd grade teacher Sandra Kim, whose classroom had become a model for innovative instruction despite severe funding limitations. She'd created learning centers using cardboard boxes and donated materials, developing engaging activities that helped students master essential skills. I spend about $300 of my own money each month on classroom supplies, Sandra told me matter-of-fact. It's worth it because I see the difference it makes for my students, but I know not every teacher can afford to do that. What if cost was never a factor? I asked, What would you do differently if you had unlimited resources for your classroom? Sandra's eyes lit up with possibility. I'd create hands-on science stations, build a classroom library with books at every reading level, set up technology centers where students could practice digital literacy skills. I'd bring in guest speakers and take field trips that connect learning to real-world experience. Consider it done, I said, making notes about enhanced classroom funding that would allow teachers like Sandra to implement their most ambitious instructional visions. These conversations with educators reinforced my conviction that teachers were the key to any successful educational initiative. All the money in the world couldn't replace the dedication, creativity, and expertise of skilled professionals who understood their students' needs. The Foundation's teacher support programs had become some of our most popular initiatives. In addition to providing classroom resources, we offered professional development stipends, graduate school scholarships, and sabbatical opportunities that allowed educators to pursue advanced training without financial hardship. Teaching used to be a profession people respected, commented veteran educator Robert Martinez during one of our teacher focus groups. Now we're constantly defending our value, explaining why our work matters. It's exhausting. Robert's frustration echoed my own experiences with Brad's dismissive attitude toward education. The systemic devaluation of teaching had contributed to teacher shortages, low morale, and reduced effectiveness across the profession. What if we could change that narrative? I asked the group. What if we could demonstrate that teaching is not only respectable but essential, and that teachers deserve both recognition and compensation that reflect their importance? The Foundation's advocacy work had begun to address these broader issues, supporting legislative efforts to increase education funding and improve teacher working conditions. We'd also launched a public awareness campaign, highlighting the expertise and impact of exceptional educators. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the students themselves. During a visit to Desert Bloom Elementary, 8-year-old Sofia Rodriguez approached me with a drawing she'd made. "This is you," she said, pointing to a figure surrounded by books and children. "My mom says you're helping make our school better. Thank you for caring about us." Sophia's simple gratitude reminded me why this work mattered more than any financial return or social recognition. Every child deserved to feel valued, supported, and hopeful about their future. The Foundation's programs were creating those conditions for thousands of students across Phoenix. The ripple effects extended beyond individual students to entire families and communities. Parents who enrolled in adult education classes often found better employment opportunities. Families who received health services through school-based clinics experienced improved overall well-being. Neighborhoods around our partner schools began to see increased civic engagement and community pride. Dr. Michael Thompson, a researcher from Arizona State University, who was evaluating our programs, shared preliminary findings during a Foundation board meeting. "What we're seeing is unprecedented," he reported. "Student achievement gains are significant, but the broader community impact is equally impressive. Property values in neighborhoods around your partner schools have increased by an average of 12%. Local businesses report higher foot traffic and increased community engagement." The data validated our comprehensive approach, but also highlighted the complex relationship between educational investment and community development. Quality schools didn't just benefit students, they strengthened entire neighborhoods. However, success also brought new challenges. Other school districts across Arizona began requesting similar partnerships, stretching our capacity to respond to growing demand. Philanthropic organizations in other states invited me to speak about replicating our model nationally. "We're reaching the limits of what we can accomplish as a single foundation," I told Harold Winters during one of our monthly planning meetings. "The demand for this type of comprehensive support far exceeds our resources, even with our substantial endowment." "That's actually a sign of success," Harold replied. "When effective programs create demand that exceeds available resources, it demonstrates the need for systemic change that involves multiple stakeholders."
Harold was right. The foundation's role was evolving from direct service provider to catalyst for broader transformation. We began working with state policymakers to develop legislation that would support similar initiatives statewide. We also started training other foundations and nonprofits to implement comparable programs in their communities. The policy advocacy work introduced me to Arizona's political landscape, a world I'd never imagined navigating as a public school teacher. But my background in education, and my foundation's track record, gave me credibility that opened doors to conversations with legislators, state officials, and influential community leaders. Martinez, your foundation's work has generated considerable interest among education policymakers, said State Senator Lisa Rodriguez during a meeting in her Phoenix office. Have you considered how these models might be scaled to serve students across Arizona? Absolutely, I replied. But scaling requires partnership with state government, other foundations, and the business community. The Martinez Foundation can't fund comprehensive support for every Arizona student, but we can demonstrate that these approaches work and advocate for the systemic changes needed to make them widely available. The conversation led to legislation that would create tax incentives for businesses that supported comprehensive school programs and allocate state funds to match private philanthropic investments in education. The political process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it offered the potential for impact that extended far beyond what any single foundation could achieve. Meanwhile, my personal life had begun to stabilize around routines that balanced foundation work with teaching and self-care. I'd moved from the Scottsdale house to Aunt Isabelle's Paradise Valley estate, a decision that had taken months to make. The mansion felt overwhelming at first, its size and elegance so different from the modest homes where I'd always lived. But gradually I'd come to appreciate the space as a reflection of Aunt Isabelle's success and a reminder of the responsibility that came with substantial resources. I'd converted one wing of the house into foundation offices, creating a workspace that allowed me to host meetings, store documents, and collaborate with staff without maintaining separate facilities. The home's gardens and courtyards provided peaceful spaces for reflection and planning. The social aspects of wealth remained challenging. Invitations to charity galas and society events filled my calendar, but I often felt like an outsider in those circles. My background as a public school teacher and my recent experience with financial struggle made me different from people who'd inherited wealth or built fortunes over decades. At a recent fundraising dinner for the Phoenix Symphony, I'd found myself seated next to Margaret Williams, the wife of a prominent real estate developer who seemed puzzled by my presence at such events. "I don't think we've met," she said with the polite interest of someone trying to place an unfamiliar face. "Are you involved with the symphony board?" "No, I support their educational outreach programs," I replied. "I'm Emily Martinez, from the Martinez Foundation." "Oh yes, the education charity," she said with a smile that suggested she viewed education as a lesser cause. "How nice that you're helping those children." "My family supports the arts, of course. We believe in maintaining cultural institutions that preserve civilization." The condescension in her tone reminded me of Brad's dismissive comments about my career, the assumption that education was somehow less important than other pursuits. But I'd learned to respond to such attitudes with confidence, rather than defensiveness. "Education and the arts are deeply connected," I replied calmly. "Many of our students participate in music and theater programs. We found that creative expression enhances academic learning and helps students develop the critical thinking skills they'll need as future leaders." Margaret's expression suggested she'd never considered education and the arts as related endeavors, but she nodded politely before turning to someone she found more interesting. These interactions reinforced my appreciation for people like David Chen and the educators who'd become my closest collaborators. They understood that meaningful work wasn't about social status or recognition, but about creating positive change in people's lives. The Foundation's first annual report, published 6 months after our launch, documented impact that exceeded even my optimistic projections. Reading achievement among participating students had improved by an average of 30%. Family engagement in school activities had doubled. Teacher retention at partner schools was significantly higher than district averages. But beyond the statistics, The report captured stories that illustrated the human impact of our work. Children who'd been struggling academically were now confident learners. Families who'd felt disconnected from their children's education were actively engaged in supporting student success. Teachers who'd been considering leaving the profession were rediscovering their passion for education. We're not just changing individual lives, I wrote in the report's conclusion. We're demonstrating that comprehensive support can transform entire communities. Every student who succeeds academically is more likely to become a productive citizen, engaged parent, and community leader. Every family that develops stronger connections to education is more likely to value learning and support their children's continued growth. The report's publication generated significant media attention, including a feature story in Arizona Republic that profiled the foundation's work and my personal journey from struggling teacher to philanthropic leader. Emily Martinez represents a new generation of philanthropists, the article concluded. Unlike traditional donors who write checks from a distance, she brings first-hand experience with the challenges facing public education and a deep commitment to sustainable solutions. The publicity brought both opportunities and complications. Other wealthy individuals began seeking my advice about effective giving. Universities invited me to speak about philanthropy and social change. But the attention also attracted criticism from people who questioned whether I was qualified to manage such substantial resources. Some people inherit money and assume they know how to solve complex social problems, wrote one critic in a letter to the editor. Good intentions aren't enough when you're dealing with systemic issues that require expertise and experience. The criticism stung, partly because it echoed my own occasional doubts about my qualification. I'd never managed a large organization before, never overseen multi-million-dollar budgets, never navigated the complex world of nonprofit governance, but I'd also learned that expertise came in many forms. My years in the classroom had taught me to understand student needs, family dynamics, and community challenges in ways that couldn't be gained from graduate school or boardroom experience. My recent financial struggles had given me empathy for families facing economic hardship, and Aunt Isabelle's gift had provided me with resources to act on insights that many experts possessed but couldn't implement. The Foundation's board of directors, which now included respected community leaders from education, business, and nonprofit sectors, provided guidance and oversight that helped ensure responsible stewardship of resources. Their diverse expertise complemented my passion and vision, creating a governance structure that balanced ambition with accountability. You bring something to this work that can't be taught, Patricia Gonzalez told me after a particularly challenging board meeting where we'd debated expansion strategies. You understand these communities because you come from them. You know what it feels like to have your potential questioned because of your circumstance. That perspective is invaluable. Her words reminded me that my background wasn't a limitation to overcome, but an asset that informed everything the foundation accomplished. The teacher who'd been dismissed as financially inadequate was now directing resources toward ensuring other educators received the respect and support they deserved. As I prepared for the foundation's first anniversary celebration, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 12 months earlier, I'd been a divorcing teacher, worried about affording a small apartment. Now I was directing one of Arizona's largest educational foundations, influencing policy at the state level, and creating opportunities for thousands of students and families. The transformation wasn't just about money, though the financial resources had made everything possible. It was about discovering that my authentic self, the person Brad had found so inadequate, was exactly who I needed to be to create meaningful change in the world. The anniversary event, held at the Phoenix Art Museum, brought together everyone who'd contributed to the foundation's early success. Students performed music and poetry they'd created in our arts program. Parents shared stories about how comprehensive support had transformed their families' educational experiences. Teachers described innovations they'd implemented with foundation resources. But the most meaningful moment came when Sofia Rodriguez, the second grader who'd given me her drawing months earlier, approached the podium with a message she'd written herself. "Thank you, Miss Martinez, for believing in us," she read in a clear, confident voice. "Because of your foundation, I know I can become anything I want to be. I want to be a teacher like you." so I can help other kids believe in themselves too. As I listened to Sophia's words, I thought about Aunt Isabelle and the wisdom she'd shown in protecting my inheritance until I was ready to use it responsibly. She'd understood that the greatest gift wasn't the money itself, but the freedom to discover my authentic purpose and the resources to pursue it without compromise. The woman who'd been called a financial burden was now empowering others to recognize their own worth and potential. The teacher who'd been told she'd never amount to anything was now creating systems that ensured other educators received the respect and support they deserved. Standing before this gathering of students, families, and community leaders who'd all been touched by our work, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every challenge I'd faced, every moment of doubt I'd experienced, every instance of being underestimated or dismissed had prepared me for this role. The inheritance had given me financial resources, but the real transformation had come from learning to value myself authentically, regardless of others' opinions or expectations. Now I could use both my resources and my hard-won wisdom to help others discover their own potential and pursue their own dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.